Well, hello everybody. Welcome to the webinar. I just want to check the sound because the last thing I want to do is spend an hour talking to myself. So look, if I would really appreciate it if just over in the question box, if you could just type in, am I coming across loud and clear? Obviously, if you can't hear me, I'm not expecting you to write anything in there, but if I am, can I just get an indication, because I'll probably need to make a few adjustments if I'm not coming across clearly. All right. Okay. Okay. So yes, coming across clearly. Good, good, good. Okay. Yep. Sounds fine. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, others. All right. So welcome to this webinar, and I'm looking forward to working with you during the process, and I'm looking forward to working with you. So what I'm going to do now is lead you through a process of talking about how you can improve your own influencing capabilities. So I'll just turn off the webcam so I can see the slides that I'm presenting to you, and we'll just go into the first slide. Okay, so basically the model that I put together looks at 4 strategies for maximising influence at work. Now, we're all in the business of influence. I'm sure you recognise that, and really what we need to do is to improve our capacity to influence, because obviously we don't get anything done if we don't have the ability to persuade other people of a certain course of action. So that becomes extremely important. So there's 3 things I would like you to get from the process, and as we go through this, I would really appreciate it if you would type in your questions over on the right hand side under the question tab. What I'll try and do is deal with each question as we go. So in other words, we're not leaving it right to the end when I'm dealing with lots of questions, if there are lots of questions. The other thing that's important before I get underway is there is a diagnostic associated with this, and I'm anticipating that you haven't done the diagnostic unless you've bought my book, and you've done it in the book. So if you're interested in doing the diagnostic, please let me know. Send me an email after this presentation, and I'll be more than happy to furnish you with that diagnostic so that you can see what your comparative strengths and opportunities for growth are as an influencer. So there are 3 things out of this session. First of all, what are these 4 influencing strategies? So what are they? So let's go through them. We'll spend a bit of time talking about those. We'll actually talk about the influencing capabilities profile, which is essentially what I just mentioned, which is a profile that you can complete either electronically or via paper. And then you've got the influencing tools for change. I want to end up this presentation with some of the different practical things that you can do to bump up your potential for improving your your influence. All right, so let's get underway. So the first question I want to ask you is, what do these 4 leaders have in common? They're coming up on your screen now, and you probably all recognise them in some way, shape or form. You may even be able to name them. They're that well known. There are 3 of them that are dead, and there's 1 that's still alive. And I'll just run through them while I'm asking you that question. What do these 4 leaders have in common? So up in the top left-hand corner, we have former Vice President of the United States, Al Gore, and a climate change activist. Underneath him, we have former Great Britain Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher. Underneath Margaret Thatcher, we have Dr. Martin Luther King, the civil rights activist in the United States. And at the bottom on the right-hand side, we have Mother Teresa, who's recently been anointed as a saint. So they're the 4 characters that I'm going to talk about, and the question that I pose to you, what do they all have in common? What they all have in common is that they're highly influential, or have been highly influential. I'm not putting them up there as exemplars of leaders, by the way, because I think it's fair to say that all four of them would have their critiques, some of them more than others. So these aren't leaders that I've selected because either A, I like them, or B, they're great leaders. I've selected them essentially because they've been enormously influential in their own way, and I've tried, of course, to get the gender balance right. I've tried, of course, to get the right wing of politics and the left wing of politics right. So I've got a little bit of balance in these four characters. But each of these four characters used a particular form of influence. So we'll use them to basically use them as illustrations of the four influencing strategies as we go through the presentation. So let's be clear before we go any further about what influence is, because I think when you mention the word influence, people can start to think that maybe I'm talking about manipulation or being cunning or being underhanded or being devious. Influence in my mind is none of those things. In fact, I've got a definition there that I believe really does embrace the work that I'm sharing with you today. So influence is the power to make other people agree with your opinions or get them to do what you want willingly and ethically. So the key words are power. Yes, there is a form of power, but power is occurring around us all the time. We can use or abuse power, as we know. And the other two key words are we're getting people to do things because they want to do it. So it's willing. They're doing it not because we're putting them under a lot of pressure. They're doing it because they willingly want to do it, and also ethically in the sense that it's transparent, they understand what's happening, and they're quite prepared to come along with it as a result of that. So you can see that, you know, if we take that definition to start with, it's a good starting point in the presentation. I guess another point I want to make before I launch into the four influencing strategies is that basically you and I, all of us in fact, are in the business of influence. If you're a leader, a manager in other words, you are actually what I would call a professional influencer. You actually get paid to influence other people. So let's be very clear about it. We're all in that business of influence. We want to influence our children. We want to influence our partner. We want to influence our colleagues. We want to influence our boss. We want to influence the people that basically report to us. So all of those things are important. Otherwise, of course, we get nothing done. We don't leave our mark. So let's be clear that we're all in that business as well. Okay. All right. So let's move on. The other thing that I'd like you to think about here is that there's basically three important variables in any influencing strategy. What do I mean by that? Well, there's your preferred style and approach. So your preferred style and approach will dictate how you'll try and influence other people. So if you are very rational and like facts and figures and logic and structure and rationality, it's likely that you're going to influence people like that. Notwithstanding how they might want to be influenced, that's how you'll tend to influence them. Now, another variable, of course, is the other person's style and approach. So obviously we've all had cases where we've tried to influence somebody or persuade them, and the glaze has gone in their eyes, and it's very clear that we're not getting anywhere. So what we try and do is we try even harder using our preferred style and approach, and of course we don't hit the mark. What we should be doing, of course, is changing our style and approach if we can recognise that it's not working. And the third variable is the situation that you're in, the context. So different situations will require different forms of influence. So those are the three critically important points. So out of today, I'm giving you an awareness of what your style and approach is, or hopefully when you look at the descriptors, you'll get an idea of that. And you'll be able to try different approaches depending on the circumstances and the person that you're trying, or persons that you're trying to influence. All right, so moving right along. So if we if we think about what I'm showing you here, which will come up on your screen very shortly, there it is, whoop, gone again, there it is. So what you're seeing on your screen at the moment is the influencing capability framework. This is my influencing capabilities framework. Let me just tell you that I put this together because when I went out and looked at the information that was out there on how to influence and persuade people, what I found was that at one end of the continuum, there was information that was far too academic and esoteric. It really couldn't be used in a very practical forum. At the other end of the continuum, there was information that I felt was too salesy. So unless you were in a sales role, it really wasn't applicable. So I thought there was a real need to find some middle ground between a very salesy form of influence and a very esoteric type of theory about influence. And so I came up with this particular framework. So there's a couple of things that are important about this framework, and you'll see some key words there. Let me put up a couple of headings. That'll come up on your screen now. Right, so the first interesting part of the framework is that there are two styles that we can adopt when we're trying to influence someone. I call these the push style or the pull style. Now, I've given you a couple of definitions there on your screen, but as you can see, the push style is more of a proposing, giving information, driving approach. So a little bit more assertive, a little bit more one way. And when you do the diagnostic, if you choose to do it, it will give you a score, a comparative score between your push and pull styles. Pull style, on the other hand, is a little bit more collaborative. It's working with and through other people. It's a little bit more enabling, and it's a little bit more seeking out information, building upon the ideas of others. So the first important part of this is which style do you favour, and how might it be possible for you to use both styles? Because the argument here is that you should be using both, depending on who it is that you're influencing or the situation that you're in. Now, the other aspect of this model is you'll notice over on the left-hand side, you've got a logical approach and an emotional approach. And so there are some people that like to influence using logic, fact, figures, rationale, evidence-based, lots of structure, tangible measurements. There are others of you that would prefer to, or just naturally tend to approach influencing from an emotional perspective. So you would use feelings and values and perceptions and so forth. And interesting that, if you have a strong bias towards one or the other, it's likely that you're alienating quite a few people when you're trying to influence them, because clearly they don't quite relate to that approach. So have a think about whether you're logical or emotional in terms of how you like to influence other people, or indeed like to be influenced yourself. Now, what all that does is it brings us to 4 different influencing strategies. So you can notice the little icons there. The investigation strategy is a push logical strategy. The calculation is a pull logical strategy. The motivation is a push emotional strategy. And the collaboration is a pull emotional strategy. So when you do the diagnostic, what you find is that it'll put you in one of those camps, and that's normally the preferred approach that you would use when you're trying to persuade somebody else. And probably what happens is that you overuse it to a point where it's not as effective as it could be. All right, so that's the general framework before I move any further. So if you've got any questions, please type them into the question box, or clarification, or comments. Anything there that might be useful, by all means, go ahead and do that. Okay. So Okay, moving on. So what we're going to do now is have a look at the capabilities that underpin this particular model. So what I'm actually showing you here is 16 influencing capabilities that are behind each of these particular strategies. So again, when you do the diagnostic, what happens is that you get the 4 underpinning capabilities. So for example, in investigation, you've got gathering evidence, counter arguments, generate ideas, and assert ideas. So the scores in those 4 add up to give you a total score for investigation. So what's important here is where are the relative low scores and where are the relative high scores. The relative low scores would suggest that you're probably not using that capability anywhere near to the extent that you should be, and the relative high scores are probably suggesting that you might be using that too much, and sometimes you should vary it and use other approaches. So for example, you might find that, if you look down under collaboration, you'll notice that building trust is one of the capabilities. And some people are better at this than others. But if that's something that you feel very strongly about in an influencing situation, you'll have a lot of difficulty working with somebody who doesn't value trust. In other words, they just want to know very clearly what the rationale is for the decision. They don't want to feel as if they've been enabled in any way, shape or form. They don't want to be sort of bought into some sort of a rapport building exercise. They simply want to know the facts. And that would be difficult for you because you rely so much on building trust as a capability, you see. You can see now how this works. So it obviously explains some people's kind of frustrations when they're actually in the business of persuading other people. All right, so the diagnostic gives you scores around all of those as well. So now what I want to do is just spend a bit of time talking about each particular strategy and paint a picture for you so that you can get a very clear idea what those 4 strategies are, and then try, I suggest, to incorporate those as much as you can in your day-to-day interactions with other people. All right, so we've got the investigation, as you know, that's in the top left-hand corner. Investigation is a logical pull strategy. So investigators, by what the term might suggest, they like facts, they like figures, they like to assertively argue their point. They use logic to persuade other people and tend to be quite methodical and structured in their approach. So normally people who have a high preference in this area are quite good at debating. So they're good at refuting other people's arguments and good at advancing their own. And the best example of those 4 characters I showed you earlier on is Al Gore. So Al Gore was a devastating, or perhaps still is, a devastating debater. He'll over-prepare for debates and get it right. And for those of you who have seen that video, and it's easy to just go to YouTube and type in Inconvenient Truth, he put together a video when he left the White House. He lost the presidency, you might recall, in that very controversial election at the turn of the century in the 2000 election through Florida. But what was interesting is that he put together this video called The Inconvenient Truth. And if you look at it, it's absolutely littered with all sorts of facts and figures and charts and graphs and statistics. He really is going overboard using the investigation strategy when he's trying to convince the audience and, of course, the people watching the video. So he's a good example of somebody that is very much across the detail, enjoys that approach. So let's take that a step further. So if you think about professions that are in the workplace that would perhaps use the investigation strategy, the first one that comes to mind is police. So police will put together a brief of evidence, And so what they're attempting to do is to demonstrate conclusively the guilt of somebody who has allegedly committed a crime, and that goes before a court of law, and the courts will make decisions based on the evidence that the police put forward or the counter evidence of their defence. So scientists and researchers, of course, put hypotheses together, and then they attempt to prove or disprove that hypothesis depending on, using a methodology which is based very much around investigation. So, that you can see that their influencing capability is very much based on the rigour of their methodology. So workplace incidents such as safety and harassment normally have to be investigated. Well, not normally, they by law at least, they should be investigated. And what happens is that after the investigation, a thorough recommendation or report is put together, and that report can be highly influential if indeed it's been done rigorously, and it's normally done by using a methodology that is logical and quite forceful in its conclusions. So it's using the push style. But if you're, and so it's very good for those kinds of things in the workplace, but where it's not a very good influencing strategy is where you've got large-scale change when people need to be engaged. So if an organisation is taking on a new strategic direction, they need to understand what that strategic direction is and be engaged in that before they can sit there and logically think about how it might be enacted in terms of the work that people do. So investigation is one of the 4 strategies, and if we look at the next strategy, and this is going across the model, so the commonality between the calculation strategy and the investigation strategy is that they both use logic, but the investigation is more of a push, whereas the calculation is more of a pull. So calculators use they like to promote the positives of a proposal, and they highlight the weaknesses of the current situation. So what they do is they put up a lot of pros and cons so that people can be moved into a direction that they need to be taken to. Now, let me give you a classic example of this. Not too long ago, I walked past a Harvey Norman store, which is a large chain of stores in Australia, and I walked past, and indeed in other parts of the world too, no doubt, walked past a store and it had a sign on the door saying 50% off laptops, which clearly would get anybody's attention, and certainly got mine. I decided to walk into the store, and as soon as I got in the store, I found that there was another sign there that said must purchase by the close of business today. You see, so that was a calculation strategy. So it's like the carrot and the stick, and it can be very, very powerful as such, and it can be very useful in terms of being able to persuade us to do something. And so retailers use it extensively. People kind of know where they stand with calculators. In fact, teachers, think about a teacher that you respected at school. I'm sure it would be fair to say that their actual style or approach would be very much one of being using calculation. In other words, you kind of knew where you stood. And what I mean by that is that people understood where the line in the sand was. If I cross that line, I'm in trouble, and if I stay on this side of the line, I'm fine. So it's a strategy of letting people know precisely where we stand. So a typical manager who has a high calculation strategy would be very strong on process and will be able to explain to people the key performance indicators clearly and be able to give feedback about those indicators as well. So an example of that would be former Prime Minister of Great Britain, Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher, people either loved Margaret Thatcher or hated her. There was absolutely nothing in between. I'm sure our audience would feel the same way, one way or the other. But one of the reasons for that is because it was clear that things were things were black and white, at least in her view of the world, and people kind of knew where they stood with her. And so she was a very strong calculator. So let's have a look at a couple of occupations that would use calculation as a strategy. And this could be quite... So, as I said before, salespeople. I mean, if you think about it, a salesperson is always leveraging the positives of the product or the service against the cons of not buying. Financial advisors will tell you that this is the very best deal going around and never to be repeated. So it puts a bit of pressure on you to buy. Animal trainers. So I took my daughter to the circus earlier this year, which is a great pleasure for both of us. And my daughter loves the circus animals, and like most young children, and basically as the ponies were doing their tricks, the trainer had a whip in one hand and a pocket full of treats in the other. So the pony either got a light whip or a treat. So they were using calculation in order to influence the pony to do certain feats or tricks. And so teachers, as I said before, is another example. So where would you use this in the workplace? Well, where you would use this is that if you have any change, any new change in the workplace that will affect the way people do work, right? This has a significant impact on the way people do work. In other words, you know, it's not just some peripheral issue, it's going to affect the way they do things. Then calculation is a good influencing strategy, because you need to explain to people what the advantages of the new change will mean for them and what the disadvantages are for not going down this road and taking on board the new changes. All right, so if I was explaining, for example, to a group of reluctant supervisors sitting in a harassment and bullying legislation training session, I might point out to them that on the one hand, they're vicariously liable should somebody be harassed in their team and they decide not to take any sort of course of action. But then on the other hand, I might talk about the advantages of being well versed in the legislation and how it can nip things in the bud. But situations where you're building a team or getting people to focus on the big picture, e.g., you're leading a new team or creating a vision for the team, calculation is not the way to go. You really got to be talking blue sky, not detail. All right, so that gives you a bit of an idea about how calculation actually may work and what it means. So let's move on to the next one. So the third one, now the big difference between the next two, as you could probably work out, is that these are below the line. In other words, the next two, which is motivation and collaboration, are influencing strategies that require emotion rather than logic. So what do I mean by that? Well, the motivators will use emotions and tug at the heartstrings. They're usually big picture thinkers, and what happens is they'll often link their proposal to the big picture, the strategic direction or the vision of the organisation. So they often have a way with words, and they can define a simple and compelling or convincing vision. So if you've ever had a chance to have a look at Martin Luther King's speech, I Have a Dream, he gave that speech, I think, in 1968. And it was one of the most famous speeches. And the reason it was such a famous speech was that it was a very much a speech based on the motivation strategy. There was very little facts in it. A lot of it was rhetoric. And anyway, if you get a chance to have a look at it, I strongly suggest you do, because it gives you a really good example of what I'm talking about. Now, don't think for a minute that you have to be a great orator in order to be able to utilise the motivation strategy. Storytelling is another way of doing this. So people who will naturally talk about stories, talking about, strategic direction and so forth, they're going to be using that motivation strategy to persuade other people. All right, so who uses this? Well, entrepreneurs. If you show me a successful entrepreneur, I'll show you somebody that very strongly favours the motivation strategy. So Sir Richard Branson or Elon Musk, these people create a compelling vision of the future, and what they do is they then sell that vision or, big picture of the future to a number of key people. So they surround themselves with people that have been bought, that are buying into the vision of the leader. So advertising executives, public relations agents, artistic directors, all of these people usually have a split second to try to get our attention and get us to buy their product or service or whatever. So what they'll do is they won't necessarily give you the facts about the product or the service, but they'll give you an emotional kind of, they'll show you something that's emotionally charged. And what that does is it gets us engaged and excited about the product or the service. So where you would use this is developing a sense of commitment, so where you want to win the hearts and minds of people. So if there's a new, exciting strategic vision or direction that you want to take a business or your team, then you really need to use the mindful motivator strategy to start with. Because once you can get people excited about the vision, you can start thinking about the details of it. So that's how you would do that. So whether it's Richard Branson wanting to, have space flights, or whether it's Elon Musk wanting a colony on Mars, whatever that big vision is, people who buy into it are going to be influenced to help that entrepreneur or whoever it is get what they need. Now, it's no good using this, on the other hand, where it's unclear about your rationale. So if people haven't got a clue why a course of action's been taken, the first thing they want to know is the logic behind the course of action. So, for example, if in your organisation there are unexpected cost-cutting measures taken, then obviously people are wanting to know the rationale behind those cost cuts before they start talking about how they might deal with it. So, so you obviously would use an investigation strategy to talk about that first before you move into some other area. Now, the final one we'll look at is collaboration. So I hope you're having a think, and just keep those questions coming through, folks, if you wouldn't mind, please, so that I can just pause at different times. And look, the collaborators will tend to influence people by using emotion, so very similar to motivation. So what's the difference? Well, what the motivation strategy does is try to connect people to a strategic vision about where we're going, whereas collaborators will attempt to influence people by creating a bond or a connection between a team or a group of people. So they work very hard at building what the French would call an esprit de corps. So calculators are great team builders, and they engage people's hearts and minds in the process. And the best example that I can think of would be Mother Teresa. So clearly she did a lot of good work in the poor parts of Calcutta and other parts all over the world, and that was really, she had to work with NGOs, she had to work with governments, she had to work with volunteers, and she had to bring all these people together to work for this common cause, and that's a collaboration strategy. So I'll just pause here for a moment because we've got a question here. I'll just see if I can respond to that. How would you describe Donald Trump? Where would he fit into the scheme of things? Well, let's have a look. That's a good question, Trish. Thank you. Well, is Donald Trump an investigator? I don't think so. I don't think he's all that interested in the detail and minutiae. Is Donald Trump a calculator? I think to a certain extent in his negotiations he may use the carrot and the stick to a certain extent. But I don't think it's his dominant style. I think he's clearly he uses emotional approaches to influence. Is Donald Trump a motivator? I suspect so. If you think about what he did during the election, he brought people together in rallies. There was very little detail in those rallies, as I understand it, but there was a lot of big picture statements about what he would do should he be elected President of the United States. In terms of collaboration, I don't think so, and you only have to look at what's happening at the moment with his team in the White House. So I would suspect that his style of influence is very much around the motivator style. And let's face it, before he, his preeminent career was around entrepreneurship. So, again, you would imagine that he would be a motivator as far as an influencing strategy would be concerned. So thanks for the question. Keep them coming in. Keep challenging me with that sort of thing. So Mother Teresa, getting back to Mother Teresa. So Mother Teresa would be very much a collaborative leader, or was, I should say. So if you actually think about people's careers, conductors of an orchestra, they don't play a musical instrument per se, but what they do is they create the ensemble, the sound, by their hand gestures. So they bring in different elements of the orchestra at different times. Obviously, it's a highly skilled role. And so they are collaborators. So they're collaborating with the orchestra to produce a beautiful ensemble. Funeral directors. Obviously, nobody enjoys dealing with funeral directors because of the circumstances, but the funeral director has to actually coordinate and collaborate with a whole range of different stakeholders in order to get results. So they have to be very good at doing that. So if you think about it, choreographers have to actually work with people carefully in order to get a good result for a show. And so where it's very, very effective is where you've got circumstances actually where there are very diverse and strongly held views. So for example, if you've got two teams that aren't working very effectively together, the best way to influence them to work better together is to use a collaboration strategy. So it would be probably to hold a meeting and get both teams in the room and start to set some ground rules and ask the team to try and work with you to resolve the communication issues that are apparent in the team. So that's the way to work with that, so that you could hear the different factions, the different points of view, give people a chance to air their views respectfully. So that would be where I would look at using that. Now, where I wouldn't use it is that if people need to know the logic and rationale behind the decision. Again, if you're introducing, say, a new procedure that's pushed down from above, so senior management has made a decision, and all of a sudden, by the time it gets to your team, it's no good you collaborating. You need to explain to them the rationale about why that decision was made, how it's going to impact on people, before you start collaborating about what you're going to do about it. So you can see that we can sometimes make mistakes when we make those sorts of decisions. All right, so one of the things that you might like to consider is I have an online influencing capabilities profile, self-assessment report. Now, for a very reasonable price, you can email me and I can send you a link and you can complete this. And what it does is it produces a 14-page report which shows you, your areas of strength, opportunities for growth. There are lots of graphs, lots of statistics, lots of ways of using your style in more effective ways. So that might be something you might like to consider at the conclusion of this webinar. I'm more than happy to talk with you about that. And what I'm showing you here, as it'll come up on your screen right now, is you're seeing actually one of the key pages in the report, in the online report. The online report, you can see there, has the percentages about where you sit around the capabilities, the 16 capabilities I went through, what your preferred strategy is. So the example that's on the screen here, you've got an equal preference between motivation and collaboration. And then it shows you also whether you are a push or a pull style leader, whether you use logic or emotion more so. So it can be quite insightful for you to look at that. So happy to talk to you about that. It also shows you in terms of priority, it shows you your highest capability through to the least. So in this case, this person here, active or listening actively, is their highest capability with 83%, and their lowest capability is offering concessions at 53%. So it gives them a strategy, or gives you a strategy to work with. So you might like to consider looking at that for yourself or your management team. And again, there's graphs to show you how your style and your approach and your strategy. So it's quite a comprehensive report, actually. All right, enough of a plug. Let me now talk to you about how you might apply some of these strategies in your own work. So if you're using investigation strategy to influence, here are some ways and means of doing that can be very effective. You can use third-party endorsement. So if you know that somebody of great credibility who has done something in the past in another organisation, or even indeed in the same organisation, they've gone through a process and they've come out the end and been successful, you can call upon their expertise in order to influence your team or the group of people that you're working with. So look, this is what authors do with their books. You go to a bookshop and on the back you'll get an endorsement from a reasonably credible person, and that endorsement is often an influencing strategy to get you to buy the book. Using structured interviews where you ask the same questions of everybody is another form of investigation. So normally when we recruit somebody, what we do and select them at least, is we ask the same candidates, we ask all the candidates the same questions so that there's a sense of validity there, and we give them a score for each question. So that, of course, is an investigation strategy. Any survey that's rigorous has some degree of influence or credibility on the basis that, we've gone in and done our homework and our investigation. And you only have to look at how influential opinion polls are for political parties and how they react to that. So they obviously can be highly influential. And you've got process mapping, and of course you can see a process map on your screen there. Process maps is where you map out the process or some process that you're using in your workplace so that you can actually have a glimpse of where the sticking points are in the process. You can actually get your team involved in a discussion around that, and if you did that, you're actually applying two influencing strategies, aren't you? Process mapping would be an investigation tool, but by bringing everyone together for a conversation, you'll be using a collaboration tool as well. So the more you can combine these, of course, the more effective they become. All right, so what about calculation? What are some strategies that you can use in terms of how you might use calculation? Well, let's have a think about this. A force field analysis. Now, Kurt Lewin was famous for a vertical line down a piece of paper, and on the left-hand side were driving forces, on the right-hand side were restraining forces. So if you have a decision to make and you need to consider the pros and cons of that decision, why not do a force field analysis and look at all the driving forces and then look at all the restraining forces. And again, if you did this with your team, you are integrating to influencing strategies, calculation and collaboration. Any cost-benefit analysis that's been done thoroughly is a highly influential tool, because if you can demonstrate clearly that the benefits of a particular approach outweigh the costs, then there's a good chance that you'll persuade the group of people that need to be persuaded to go down a particular route. On the other hand, if the costs outweigh the benefits, then it's probably good that that idea gets shelved and you move on to the next big thing. So you can see that that becomes very, very powerful. And the military, for those of you who have had a military background, would probably understand this implicitly. In the military, people are obsessed with doing a debrief, and a debrief is really what we would call an after-action review. So basically there are three questions: what went well, what didn't go well, and thirdly, what will we do differently next time as a result of what we've learnt. And so that can be a very powerful strategy that can also be used with collaboration. It surprises me how few people and organisations use after-action reviews, but nevertheless, they're extremely effective when they're used properly. All right, so let's look at some motivation tools that you might like to try if this is an area that's perhaps not your strong suit. And again, the diagnostic will show you that. But a team values charter. Now, a team values charter is something that I designed to galvanise a team around a common cause. So how the team values charter works is like this. We ask each person in the team 4 specific questions, and each person in the team has to answer those questions, preferably in written format initially, so they have to think about it. We ask them at the meeting, and the first question is, if there was one value that was important to you working in this team, what would it be? So they might say respect. Second question is, define what that value means, and the person might then extend that to say that respect means that we do value the opinions of everybody in the team. Okay, third question is, why is it important to you? Because it's good for a leader to know why somebody does hold a value very dear. So this person might say, well, respect is important to me because I would like to think that everyone is given an equal opportunity to contribute in this team. And the fourth and final question is, what behaviours would underpin that value? And the behaviours in this case would be things like not interrupting people when they're speaking, giving people a chance to finish their answer, and so forth. So very powerful and works really well. The GROW model, those of you who have been exposed to the GROW model, it's a great methodology, and it stands for GROW, stands for goal, R for reality, O for options, and W for what next. So when you're having a conversation with somebody, you can steer the conversation using the GROW model as a framework, and you'll find that the person will embrace whatever it is they come up with, because people don't argue with their own data, and all you're doing is gently taking them on a journey of self-discovery. If you tell a story, it can be highly powerful and influential, particularly if it's in a mentoring arrangement. People respond very well to stories, as we know. And incidentally, speaking of stories, do you start your meetings the right way at work, or do you just dive into the problems? I would strongly suggest you start your meetings with a good news, a win for the week, or good news story, whatever you want to call it. So you actually go around the group, starting with yourself, and share some good news that's happened to you during the course of the week. Now, you'll find that some people will find that difficult to respond to because they're just not programmed to be thinking of positives. But the reality is there's always been good things that happen to us day to day. So get people to share that, and what you're doing is you're creating an upward spiral of positivity rather than a downward spiral of negativity. And that's a good way to start a meeting, because let's face it, you're going to be talking about all the problems and so forth. So start with things that go well, and you'll find that it's a really, really good exercise. All right, so in collaboration, what can we do in order to help us become better collaborators? Okay, do what the late Dr. Stephen Covey talked about in his magnificent book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Covey said, begin with the end in mind. So what he meant by that was that when you have a team discussion, let the team know up front what you intend to get out of this discussion. So you might say to them, look, at the end of this discussion, I want to be able to get a clear way forward that we will all accept. I don't care what that way is, but I do want that as a goal. And then you can launch into a conversation with your team about how you might get there. So it's starting with the end in mind, if you can see what I mean. Okay, we just got another question coming through, so I'll just pause there and respond. Tim, do you think people can really use the other influencing styles successfully if it's not their inherent style, as it wouldn't come naturally to them? That's a great question, thank you. And yes, I do. I look, if you actually looked at what I'm doing in this presentation, you can see that I'm using a range of different strategies to influence you. Yes, you can. Of course, it takes a bit of practice, and you may well default back to your natural style from time to time. But let me assure you that you can learn these things. You see, that's why I'm going through these tools. If you take a tool-based approach, all you've got to do is implement that. So, I mean, anyone, for example, can introduce a good news, win for the week at the beginning of their meeting. Even if you're not inclined that way, you can still do that, right? Everyone can do a cost-benefit analysis, even if that's not your thing. So you can see that you can. In fact, I would actually suggest to you that it's actually in your interest to learn all 4. If you want to be highly persuasive, then my suggestion to you is that you need to implement all 4 and be extremely flexible in how you might adopt those 4 strategies. So, in other words, if plan A is not working, instead of banging your head against the brick wall, in other words, keep doing what comes naturally to you, stop, take a deep breath and try a plan B, which may be a diametrically opposite influencing strategy. It is possible to do that, and we've all got that capability. So yes, it is possible. In fact, if you actually think about it, you could divide the world up into 4. So each one would gravitate to one of those 4. So by only using one influencing strategy, albeit very successfully, you're actually alienating 3/4 of the population, you see. So you don't know. And can I suggest to you that when you've got a large group, you need to be using all 4, because the law of averages would suggest that you've probably got the 4 influencing strategies represented in the room. Okay, so hopefully that's answered your question. You certainly can change. So collaboration, just to finish up, and then we're done. And if you've got other questions, please, now's the time to put them in the question box. So you giving effective feedback. Giving effective feedback is actually a collaboration tool. I wonder if you've ever thought about it that way. You often should ask the other person how they think they went in that project. Give them the opportunity to respond first. Then you can add your pieces at the end. So it should be very much a collaborative exercise and not just you in a one-way exercise to somebody else. Using problem solving, so looking at a problem and working your way through it with a person or persons, clearly is a collaborative strategy. And if you're listening to somebody one-on-one and you paraphrase what they say, so you might say, so in other words, you found this very challenging because you weren't given the right information at the right time, and that's why you're suggesting that your report wasn't up to its normal high standard. They might have spent half an hour telling you that, but essentially that's what you've heard, that message. So you're collaborating with them to make sure you've got it clear. So active listening is a collaboration tool, and some of us, of course, are better than others at listening, but all of us should be making an effort to become better listeners because it's really in our interest to do that. So guys, there are 4 strategies for each, or 4 tools. My book, the New Influencing Toolkit, actually has 64. So if you're interested and you want to look at some other ways, get a hold of my book because it has 64 different tools in it. That's why I call it a toolkit. Okay. So what's the message out of all of this for you and me? Well, the message is pretty simple, and that is to be more effective at change. In other words, any influencing is about change. You need to use all 4 strategies. So the idea is not to just default back to your preferred style, but to try different strategies and approaches and try and experiment with that. So the beautiful thing about this is straight after this webinar, which will end very shortly, you will be able to go and practice this immediately, which is really exciting. And if you want to get a better handle, obviously, on your style and approach, then contact me and we can organise for you to do the influencing capabilities profile. Just a couple of quick things before I finish, and if you've got questions, we've got one here, I better just respond to that before I launch into something else. So what was involved in developing the diagnostic tool? What does it cost? Yep, the cost is $75, and for that you get a 14-page comprehensive report. You obviously have to input the data, and that report can be very effective in helping you develop yourself as an influencing, as somebody who wants to improve their influence. So hopefully that's responded to your question, Pauline, but if you're interested, just come back to me after the webinar. So the other thing is I'm quite happy to offer any of you a 20% discount on my book. If you come back to me straight after the webinar and indicate your interest, I can send you a code. You can go on my website, implement that code, and you'll get a 20% discount off the book as such. And the only other thing I just wanted to say before we finish up is I have a very popular series called Lunch and Learn, and I've got another one coming up very soon, and it's designed for leaders, and influencing capabilities incidentally is part of that. So if you signed up for that, you would get the profile as part of the cost. But we're covering a whole lot of other areas, such as how to run more effective meetings, ways and means of giving better feedback, understanding people and their personalities, and a whole range of other things. And it's become very, very popular and cost effective. So again, if you're interested, just let me know and I'll send you a flyer and you can have a look at how the program might work for you. So guys, that's pretty much it, unless we've got any other questions coming through. Hopefully you found that informative and given you food for thought about your ability to influence other people. And the good news about the model, of course, is that you can apply it to anyone, and after a while, with a bit of practice, you can work out what their influencing strategy is, their preferred influencing strategy. And if you know that, you can just tailor your whole approach to meet with their particular, their particular strategy, or match their particular strategy. And you might think that's being very manipulative, but actually it's showing great empathy. It's saying that I'm going to treat people not so much how I want to be treated, which of course is the golden rule, but what you're saying is I'm going to treat people how they want to be treated, which is the platinum rule. So I'm actually going to do what is going to assist the other person to understand what I'm proposing. Still their choice, of course, about whether they're persuaded or not, but at the end of the day, you're giving yourself the very best chance that you might be persuasive. So thank you, folks. I've enjoyed working with you, and as I said, send me an email if you're interested in any of the things that I've talked about, and of course you're more than welcome to sign up for any of these free webinars that I've got on once a month for the rest of the year. Thank you very much, and goodbye.